So we're on to section 9 of Making It Look Great 6, and what we're going to do in this part is we're just going to have a quick look at the cloner object and a couple of settings that we're going to use in the next class. Once we've had a look at this, then we can jump back into our main scene and crack on adding some more graphic elements. Now, as you can see in this scene, I've got a cloner object with two cubes, and if we select the top cube, you can see that it has a 200 by 200 by 200 with a fillet of 0 meters. And if we select the bottom cube, you can see that it has a size of 1000 by 20 by 200, and it has a fillet radius of 10. And they're in a cloner object, and this is set to a count of 2 with clones iterate in a linear mode. And as you can see, we can see our two clones. So it's all pretty clear stuff. If we zoom out and increase the number of clones, let's just put out a little bit more, so say 10, and you can see that it alternates between each clone. And this is because the clones are set to iterate. So if we had more in here, what we'd do is sequentially travel down the hierarchy until it reached the end, and then it would jump back to the beginning and carry on through. Because we've only got 2, it just alternates between them. So if we click on the clones menu and have a look, we have the option in here to change this to a few different settings, and this is what we're going to have a look at in the next part of the main class. But let's just run through them now anyway. If we select cluster, you can see that what happens is it clusters together the both objects. If we switch the cloner off, you can see that that is how they look in the editor, and rather than iterate through them, it takes them as a group, as if they were in a null. So you get 10 of each. The next option in the list is iterate, which we've looked at. Then we have random. And as you can probably imagine, random randomizes the clone that's being picked. So if we had more than 2, then we'd have more than 2 being visible here, and we'd have much more randomness. But hopefully you'll get the idea. We have a seed value when you choose random, and we can then choose the random seed. So if you don't like the randomness that it's creating, you can change this value, and it will generate a different set of random clones. So that's pretty useful too. The next option is blend, which I'll come back to in a moment. And finally, you have the sort mode. Okay, now sort doesn't seem to do anything, but what sort does is it uses an effector to display which clone is visible. So you could use something like a shader effector, and if you had 2 clones in here, as we do now, when the shader effector is white, it will show clone number 1, and when it is black, it will show clone number 2. So if you had a noise shader on there, you would get a random effect. If you had 20 clones in there and you had a gradient in your shader effector, then it would basically blend between all of them. It wouldn't actually blend, it would just show them in order. So that certainly has its uses as well. But what I'd like to look at in here is the blend mode, because this is the mode that we're going to be working with in this part of the tutorial. And as you can see, when we choose blend mode, what happens is it blends between the parameters that are actually on our object. So we have a cube here with a fillet of none and these dimensions, and at the end the cube has different dimensions and a fillet of 10. And if you look at the clones that are generated, we have a nice smooth interpolation between those values. So what the clone is actually doing here is it's actually interpolating the parameters of these parametric objects. If we switch to the cloner and just set the Y distance to 0, we can take the bottom clone here and we can pull it out. As you can see, at the moment nothing happens. So if we undo that, select our cloner object, let's uncheck fix clone. If we now select our bottom cube and pull it out, you can see that the blend mode is working on the position as well. So it's not only blending between the parameters, it's blending the position. If we take our object and we rotate it, you can see that it also blends through the rotation parameters. And if we scale it, it's going to blend between those as well. So that's pretty cool stuff. So you could use that, for instance, if you created a book and you created the first page and then the second page was kind of half open, you could then generate hundreds of pages in between, use the blend mode, and it would blend the actual pages so it looked like the pages were kind of opening between the two originals. So blending between position, scale, rotation is one thing, but I think the power really is that it can blend through the parameters of objects. So if you're using a polygon object, then the blending won't morph between the shapes, but it will blend between the PS and R. Let's give you another example of how using it to blend between parameters can produce some really incredible results. So let's just duplicate the cloner here and take our cubes out. Let's add in a light. Okay. And if we just come down to the General tab and make this a spotlight, I'm going to rotate it down, just so it's pointing down at my cubes that I've already made, and let's drag this into the cloner object. Let's take the cloner, and let's just pull it up. So at the moment, even though it's set to a count of 10, we can't see anything, because there's no translations going on and we only have one light. So let's take this light and let's just duplicate it and pull it out, and as you can see, we're now getting a blend between our lights. Cool stuff. Let's just switch to the side view so I can make sure I kind of line these up, because I haven't used any specific values, so I'm just going to line them up so they're kind of above the cubes that we've made. Let's switch to the cloner object, transform, and let's just switch the color to white. And if we render now, you can see that our spotlights are all hitting our cubes. But at the moment, light 1 and light 2 are both exactly the same. So let's switch to light 1 and let's actually give it a pink color. Let's switch to light 2 and let's give this a blue color. So now you can see that the blend mode is working on our color parameter. So when we render, we now have the lights blending between the red and the blue. If we added another light in between with a different color, then we could create some really interesting effects. Imagine trying to do this without using the cloner. Sure, you could do it by duplicating loads of lights and adjusting the color, but then your client might say, okay, I want that one to be green instead of red. In here, you can just switch it to green and all the interpolation works for you. So you can hopefully now see some of the power. So if we come into the Details tab, we can change the inner angle. Let's set this to 30 and let's set the outer angle to 75. Again, this is interpolating between these values. I think this looked nicer actually with a sort of red colour, so let's do that. Again, we could adjust any of these parameters and this will be interpolated by our cloner object. So all in all, pretty neat stuff. Let's add in a floor object and just pull this down. If we render now, we can see the effect of our lights slightly more clearly. They're a little bit blown out, but that's because they're all set to 100. We could select one of them in the General tab and reduce the intensity down to say 25. And now the intensity is interpolated too. Okay, let's set this one down to say 65, just so that none of them are too bright and we've got a nice tonal range appearing. So as you can see, this is a very, very powerful part of the MoGraph cloner object, and it all happens in this one, he says, in this one menu, in the clones menu. So even this menu alone has the power to totally change the things that you can do in your scene. So I've jumped back into the main scene so we can explore this concept a little bit further and actually put it into action. So first of all, let's jump forward in time. Somewhere around here looks good. I think we could add some extra elements in here, and what we could do is we could have some kind of blocks or something orbiting around the globe in the football. And I'm going to use the cloner for this as I described in the earlier part of this tutorial. So first of all, let's come to the MoGraph menu and add in a cloner object. I'm going to call this cloner blocks narrow, and hold down shift and let's add a polygon object to this. So the polygon object is a primitive polygon and it actually has its own parameters in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a few of these, all with slightly varying sizes. So the first one I'm going to create width of 4, height of 12, and I'm going to set the orientation to +Z. If we then control drag this to create a copy, set the next one to 12 by 12. Control drag to create another copy. This one I'm going to set to 24 by 12, and let's make one more copy, and on this let's set it to be 50 by 12. So they basically are the same height and they just get longer on the width dimension. If we select all of these objects, switch to layer browser, we can add them to MoGraph generic, just to keep our scene in order as we go. Switch to the Attributes Manager, switch to the Object tab for the cloner. For the mode, I'm going to switch to radial, and as you can see from the little image, the radial clones in a kind of circular fashion. So if we increase the radius, as we increase it, you can see our clones become visible. So let's set this to say 400. Okay, we can't actually see what we're doing, so I'm going to set it for 500 for now. I think I'm actually going to go to 400 afterwards, but I'll come back to that in a while. Let's set the number of clones to say 60. So now we have a large number of clones, and as you can see, it's using the iterate mode, so it's going through them one by one and then coming back to the beginning. If we switch this to blend, it starts with the very thin polygon and then blends all the way round to the very wide polygon. So the blend mode is working perfectly well there. What I want to do is I want to adjust the plane that it's on, so it's XZ, so that it then kind of orbits like Saturn's rings. Let's pull this attribute down for a moment and unfold our null sphere, and let's take our cloner blocks narrow and drop it into here. Switch to the coordinates tab and let's just zero out the bank so that it's kind of banked at the same angle as our sphere. Switch back to the object tab, let's just pull this up a little bit more, pull this down so we can see what we're working with. As you can see, we have a start and an end angle. We also have an offset, and if we scrub the offset, let's just lock this and deselect so you can see it a little bit more clearly. It's still not too clear, but hopefully you'll get the idea. But as I scrub the offset, you can see that the cloner rotates. If we just select this and come to the top view, you can see it there. Hopefully that's a little bit more clearly. I don't really want it to be radius of 500 because it's going through the type here, but we'll come back to the radius a little bit later. Let's just set the offset back to 0 for now. And the other thing that we can do is we can set a variation on the offset. So if we set that to be 50 and then scrub the offset value, it kind of gives it a randomness, and what happens is that different clones offset in different directions. So as I scrub this value now, you can see what's going on, hopefully. Let's go a bit nearer, there we go. So some clones move faster than others. Generally it gives it quite a nice random kind of feel, and that's the effect that I'm after. I'm going to set this to 0, and what I want to do is I want to use the rotation of my sphere to kind of change the offset value. And the reason that I want to do that is because when the sphere rotates at high speed, then this will change much faster. So the kind of motion of the offset will be linked to the sphere, and that will help bind it all together and give it some continuity. Now before we do that, I think it's probably a good idea to make some materials for these polygons so that we can actually see a little bit more clearly what's going on, because I can probably imagine once this has been captured and compressed, it's going to be a little bit grey and hard to see. So for this I'm going to create some very simple luminant materials similar to the orange gradient that I've already created. So I'm going to control drag my orange gradient, and let's call this orange Fresnel, and yes, I'm going to use my favourite shader, the Fresnel shader. I've selected this, it's not appearing in the attribute manager. That's because I locked it earlier. So let's just select it again. If we switch to the luminance tab, let's fold up the colour for now, come to gradient. First of all I just want to copy the gradient, come back, and now I can add in, butterfingers, add the Fresnel effect. right click and paste that in, and there you go, you can see the effect. And that's all I'm going to do for this. They're very small objects, I just want them to look nice and bright. So now I'm going to control drag and create a copy of this. Open the Fresnel, let's right click and just invert knots. So now we've got two very similar, but what will happen is on this one, as the planes come around the edge of the sphere and their angle increases towards the camera, they'll go more orange, and here they'll be much lighter, and then there'll be the reverse effect for this. And on this one, I'm just going to call this red Fresnel, and you've guessed it, I'm going to use red colours. So let's just take this and just slide the hue slider down to red. I can control drag this to create another one, and again let's just invert the knots. So that's pretty quick and easy, and we have 4 new materials from here. So let's just drag them onto our polygon objects like so, and there we go. And if we choose render active object, you can see the effect. Because our offset is at 0, we're getting a nice blend between our shaders as well. So the next thing to do is to take this offset parameter and let's link it to our rotation. If you remember from the earlier tutorials, the sphere to clone onto has the rotation parameters. We can click on coordinates and have a look, and here we can see the rotation heading is the animated parameter. So let's right click on here and choose animation set driver, switch to our cloner, object tab, and on the offset value choose animation set driven. You can see the offset value immediately becomes 195. It's also created this Espresso tag. If we open this up, you can see that we have our cloner blocks narrow offset as the input with a range mapper in between, and our sphere to clone onto rotation as an output. So this rotation value is output from here into the range mapper. The value from the range mapper is output into the offset parameter. If we click on the range mapper, you can see that the input lower and upper is the same here as it is here. So basically all the values that are input will be output exactly the same. So you don't really need a range mapper in this instance, but it's good to have it in there because we can always come in here and think, oh, it's rotating a bit fast, and we could then set this to be 180, for instance, to half the values. I'm going to leave it at 360 for now. And if we now come back, and as we scrub through, you can see, let's just deselect, you can see the clones are all being offset around the sphere, and the motion is very similar, the speed, to our sphere, and as it zooms back they move much faster. Great, so that's the effect I was after. Looks a bit lonely there all on its own, not really much of a graphic element, is it, at the moment? I think what I want to do is create quite a few more of these, and what we can do is we can actually clone our cloner. But if we take our cloner and just clone it as it is at the moment, all of the clones that it creates will be exactly the same. So that's not going to be too interesting either. So what I'd like to do is use the blend mode again, but this time blend between the two cloners. And by blending between the two cloners, what happens is that we can add in an effector and we can randomize the parameters that are being blended. So if we created one cloner at the bottom that had a certain radius and another at the top which was much narrower, using the blend mode to clone between those cloners would interpolate that radius. If we then randomize it, then all the clones will receive a random radius. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So first things first, let's create another cloner. Let's take our cloner blocks narrow, control drag to create a new one. And let's call this bottom one here cloner blocks wide. If we double click the Espresso, you can see that this Espresso node has updated to be the correct name. If we double click this to check, this one is still referring to the blocks narrow. So our Espresso is updated for us. That's quite a handy feature that it does that for us. Sometimes it's a little bit of a gotcha. So when you are duplicating objects with Espresso tags, bear in mind that you might need to check that. Come back to our view menu. Let's just Alt double click cloner blocks narrow to hide it. And now we've got cloner blocks wide. First thing I'm going to do is adjust the polygons so that they're all different shapes. You can see that this cloner also has a radius of 500, so I'm actually going to set this to be 800. And you can see it's immediately larger. Let's select the original cloner that we created and let's set this down to 400. So now we have a radius of 400 and a radius of 800. The other thing that I'm going to do is if we come into the Espresso and select our range mapper, what we can do is we can reverse the output values. And what that means is that this cloner will kind of turn in the opposite direction to the other one. But again, the rotation is still going to be linked to the rotation of our sphere. So we're going to have this cloner rotating, say, clockwise, this one anti-clockwise, all in time with the sphere. It's all starting to come together. Cool stuff. So if we come to the top view and have a look and scrub, let's just unhide the top cloner there and select both so they're kind of white. So you can see one of them here and one of them here. And as you can see, they are actually twisting in opposite directions. Cool stuff. And we can check that by clicking on the cloner here. Look at the value. That's kind of increasing. If we select the other one, you can see that that is decreasing. So this is really making animation much easier for us because it's all kind of being done automatically. You know, we've animated our sphere. All these things are kind of linked to it, and if we adjust the sphere animation, then all the other elements will kind of adjust with it. So these kind of workflows do keep it much simpler for you and just makes life easier. You don't have to end up editing hundreds and hundreds of keyframes, trying to keep them all in sync. If you've got to speed it up, slow it down, change the duration, those kind of stuff. Now we have these two cloner objects set up. We can clone between them, and to do that we're going to add in another cloner. So let's just select the top cloner object here, hold the Alt key down, add in a new cloner object just so that it becomes the parent and it's in the same position and rotation. And let's call this cloner block repeat, and I'm going to add this to my layer browser into MoGraph generic. And also just going to drop my matrix object in there because I've noticed that's not part of the layer. Okay, so come to our cloner block repeat. Let's add in the other cloner we just created. Switch to our cloner block repeat, and you can see that if we increase the count, maybe we don't really want that many. Let's move a little bit later in time, and you can see that it's repeating using iterate and basically iterating between these two cloners that we've already created. We don't really want to do that. What we want to do is, well, what I actually want to do is create lots of random cloners based on the parameters that I've set in these two. So the easiest way to do that is to kind of blend between them and then randomize the parameters. We've already had a look at the blending procedure. So let's first of all just set the count to 10. Also, I think what I want to do is set the Y value to something like 400, just so there's a bigger gap between each one, and you can clearly see what's going on now. So it's kind of wide cloner, narrow cloner, wide cloner, narrow cloner. If we set the clones to blend, you can see now that it's blending between them. If we reduce the distance down, that'll be a little bit more clear. So it's working as described. Okay, undo that, and let's just set that back to 400. I think what I want to do is move the cloner block repeat down somewhat, just so that it isn't sort of centered around the sphere. We could select our cloner, grab the y-axis and just pull it down. That's certainly one way of doing it. I'm actually going to do it slightly different. What I'm going to do is, with the cloner selected, switch to the transform tab, and in here we can adjust the X, Y and Z position of all our clones. So if we set that to be kind of something like minus 1000 maybe, okay, maybe minus 2000, That looks okay, but I don't really want to have the clone right there in the middle because that's where my text is going to be. So let's set it to 1800. There we go. So now they'll kind of be bordering the text as it comes around. If we jump back in time, yeah, I mean that looks okay. Let's come forward in time again so we can see all of the range, and our blend mode is working lovely. What I said before, I'd like to randomize that, and the way we can do that is we can use a effector, and the most obvious effector to use for this would be the random effector. So with the cloner block repeat selected, come to the MoGraph menu and choose random effector. Okay, and you can see that what's happened here is all the clones have randomly moved around. Let's call this random blocks, just so we know which cloner it's referring to. And we can drag this right to the bottom of the hierarchy. I've got all my effectors down there. I just prefer to keep everything nice and neat. And let's also add this to my effectors layer. So with the random blocks effector selected, let's come to the parameter tab. I don't actually want to adjust the position of these, although I can randomize them. So sure, that's one option, and that breaks up the blend somewhat. Let's just switch that off for now. And so we're not actually randomizing the position, scale or rotation. Color mode is off. We have these other parameters down here which we haven't really looked at until now. And what I want to do is I want to modify the clone. So to do that, we adjust the modify clone parameter. If we drag this up, what this is actually doing is it's randomizing the blend. And as you can see, the cloner is still blending between the parameters that we have created, and then the random effector is randomizing those values. So nothing exceeds the maximum and nothing exceeds the minimum that we've set, but we get random values in between. If we scrub this, you can see that everything still rotates as before. Some of them are moving a little bit more slowly, some of them a little bit more quickly, some of them clockwise, some of them anti-clockwise. You may think, okay, I'm not 100% happy with that result. I think they could be more random. So we can come to the effector tab and we can actually adjust the random seed, and you can just change this until you get a look that you're happy with. Say something like that. Cool stuff. So that's the cloner blend mode, and then affecting the clones using effectors. You can do some pretty powerful stuff with the blend mode. I think it's one of the top features in the cloner object, and I don't think it gets used quite as much as it could, because I'm not sure that enough people out there really understand the power of it, especially blending between parameters on parametric objects. Even just the light example I think is pretty cool. And let's just render the scene, and we can see all our blocks. Don't they look lovely? So if we just scrub back, so we're a little bit closer, and you can see that they're all turning kind of randomly, and we're getting some pretty cool effects going on, especially when we're close up here. I think they add quite a nice touch. There we go. I think that pretty much wraps it up for this part of the tutorial. Hopefully it all made sense, and that's inspired you to create some cool stuff yourself. And the next part of the tutorial, we're going to add one more element in 3D. Then we're going to go through and look at creating all our external compositing tags, make sure everything's set up as we like for our output, and then we can render it out. We're going to move over to After Effects to create some extra elements and composite it all together. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this part, and I'll see you in the next section.